Thank you, Dee, and hello, everyone. It's really a great pleasure for me to introduce my friend and colleague, Tanya Henderson. Tanya is a very skilled human rights and gender lawyer. She has focused really with her full passion on advancing the rights of women and women's role in peacemaking worldwide. She really, in short, is all about advancing women power peace, which you notice is WAN's core mission as well, which is why we were thrilled to have Tanya as a policy director and had her as a very direct colleague working on our Women, Peace, and Security work here at WAN, where she did some amazing things. And we were sad when she left, but also so inspired and proud of Tanya as she took on this really exciting mission of carrying out a vision to empower women's political leadership globally with her project Minas List. And I'm so excited to have her tell us more about Minas List and what she's been doing and what some of the next steps that we can all take to help her advance her important women power peace mission. So please take it away, Tanya.
Okay, hello everybody. I'm also so excited to be here with you today, and Kathy and Udzi, thank you for the introduction. And it's really, because of my time at WAND that I really came to, the realization of how important it was to empower women politically, not just at a grassroots level, which had really been the bulk of my previous work. So as Kathy mentioned, for probably since about 2010, I've been working in the field of women, peace, and security. However, in my role as policy director at WAND, I was tasked with this very special project that brought together women legislators from Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Mina region, and the US to build a coalition of international women policymakers who were committed to advancing the women, peace, and security agenda, both nationally and internationally. And it was over the course of these gatherings that I began to realize how desperately our world needed more women leaders like the ones that I was working with. Their commitment to advancing positive social change was fierce, their wisdom was rooted in daily life struggles, and their courage was unfathomable. So I'd like to share actually one particular example of how, one of these leaders, it was really her story that fully inspired me to start Mina's List. So the Honorable Shinkai Carolcall, which, she's quite public both in her role as a parliamentarian in Afghanistan and her, just fierce advocacy for women's rights and peace. So the story is that, Ms. Carolcall has been a parliamentarian in the Afghan National Assembly since 2005, where she really works for conflict prevention, peace building, and women's rights. And I heard a story that she told, I actually believe it might have even been one of the WAND lobby days, where she was talking about how in 2009 there had been, she had been the only parliamentarian to oppose a personal status law against Shiite women that would completely have rolled back women's rights, Shiite women's rights in the country. And so when the bill passed without debate, Ms. Carolcall reached out to international media and offered to give them an exclusive interview under the condition that it be published early in the morning, on one morning, 6 a.m. in the morning of a specific date. And the date that Ms. Carolcall requested was actually the day that international donor countries would be meeting with President Karzai to discuss international funding following the 2014 scheduled troop withdrawal. So, just her strategic mind to really ensure, to not give up, right, when this bill was passed. And so on the morning of this day that the donor agencies were meeting with Karzai, her interview was the first thing that they saw on their BlackBerry. So they all marched into the office, said our funding's tied to gender equality, and sent the draft bill back. And by the time the draft bill went back to Parliament, she had already personally introduced, prepared over 50 amendments that reinstated women's rights. So after hearing this story, I just started to think, why aren't there more women like Shinkai in Parliament? Why was she the only one that stood up? to oppose this law? And essentially, what are the barriers from preventing more women to be empowered political leaders like her? So, Mina's List. I founded Mina's List with the aim to achieve women's equal and substantive political representation in national governments worldwide. Despite comprising over 50% of the world's population, women continue to be notably underrepresented in politics, and gender inequality remains prevalent in all sectors of society. So currently, globally, only 1 in 5 parliamentarians is female, and in 37 countries, women account for less than 10% of parliamentarians in the single or lower house. And I think, we often hear this statistic, 1 in 5, 20%, and we're like, okay, it's not so bad, right? It's not like only 3% of women in parliament in Lebanon, where I did gender trainings there. But if you look at this diagram, you really can see how unbalanced our governments actually are. And Mina's List isn't just committed to equal representation, but substantive representation, which means that the women elected leaders are actually willing and able to advocate for women's interests in the political arena. What we found is that even when women are elected to national government, either they, sometimes they lack the sufficient skills or willingness to address issues of gender equality, or because of the historical marginalization of women, political life is largely, organized according to male norms. Right? So male standards of evaluation, even in some cases male lifestyles. So as a result, women policymakers may feel that they must copy or adopt the policy agendas of their male colleagues in order to survive politically. And in other cases, women are put forth as candidates merely to fulfill a legal requirement for female representation, which is really, sadly the case where there's this growing trend of political quotas, but not necessarily women taking those seats that, that are fully empowered to represent a woman's rights. So, while having more women in politics unquestionably makes government more receptive to the interests of women, substantive representation ensures that the women policymakers are empowered to act on behalf of women's political concerns. So, what's preventing, women's equal and substantive participation? So according to the UN 2011 General Assembly resolution on women's political participation, quote, women in every part of the world continue to be largely marginalized from the political sphere, often as a result of discriminatory laws, practices, and attitudes and gender stereotypes, low levels of education, lack of access to health care, and the disproportionate effect of poverty on women. I also found that, as I continue to really study this, because many of us know that lack of finances is just universally one of the biggest barriers, that women's historical exclusion from the public realm of business and politics and her relegation to the private sphere of home and family has largely limited female candidates' access to the circles of power and money networks that are available to men. So traditional networks arise from associations with business and trade groups, unions, even sporting events. And women's historical absence from these associations, compounded by their own lower economic status, actually greatly hampers their ability to build the political support they need and raise sufficient funds to run a successful campaign. For example, in Nigeria's 2015 elections, although women's organizations really mobilized there, and they trained over 300 women and girls across 10 different states to really get engaged in the general election, 90% of the women candidates were eliminated in the primaries. So they didn't even make it to the general parliamentary elections because they just didn't have the same access to power resources as their male counterparts. Additional status disadvantages within some political systems, such as absence of functioning party system, backing by political parties, misogynistic climate, or predominantly illiterate electorate, as well as social and cultural norms, further hamper women's ability to get elected to public office. So, for example, Rona Tareen was a candidate for 2005 parliamentarian elections in Afghanistan, and she reports, "I'm under a burqa. People can't even recognize me. Men can go to the mosque and talk in public. Women must talk to individuals. You can't have the same large gathering." And so when I actually asked some of the Afghan women, from the more traditional regions, I said, well, how do you campaign? How do you fundraise if you're not even allowed to, talk to, men that aren't your family members? And they said, well, we're reliant on our husbands, our brothers, our fathers to campaign on our behalf. right? So, it's just kind of putting a whole nother level. And even in cases where there's legislative quotas and public funding to encourage gender equality, women candidates are often at best overshadowed by male-dominated electoral lists, or worse, not visible at all. So these two posters that you're looking at right now, this is from provincial elections in Morocco in the 2015 elections. And the poster on your left, this is the Party of Justice and Development, PJD. And candidates here, the women list, are on the bottom of the poster, right? And there's a handful of women in the general list, but they're so overshadowed by the sheer number of male candidates that they just kind of get lost in the shuffle. And then, worse, the poster on the right is from the Union Socialiste des Forces Populaires Party, and they don't even post the photos of the women candidates nominated. Only pictures of the men are included. And this practice of not including photos of women candidates on party lists has been criticized in a number of other elections, including Egypt's Salafi party Al-Noor, who distributed a poster with the image of a rose instead of the face of their female candidates. So you can imagine, how do you even just create political support? People don't know who you are. However, when politically represented, the presence of women in government is critical, and it secures not only the equal rights of women, but also, really advances democracy and governance itself. Women bring important and different skills and perspectives to the policy-making table in comparison with their male counterparts. Research increasingly shows that when women are politically empowered leaders, more laws are introduced that advance the rights of women. In Morocco, after a 2011 gender quota was introduced, the number of women in politics rose dramatically, and it directly resulted in broad, amendments to the family code, the penal code, labor and property laws that substantially advance women's rights. It was just extraordinary. And they, finally were able to abolish the law of shame, which, which allowed rapists to marry their victims to escape prosecution. And additionally, this research has shown that in places as diverse as Timor-Leste, Croatia, Morocco, Rwanda, and South Africa, an increase in the number of female lawmakers has led to legislation related to anti-discrimination, domestic violence, family codes, inheritance, child support, and protection. Additionally, countries also experience higher standards of living and better infrastructure and health and water. And I think that this was such a great statistic. In West Bengal, villages with greater numbers of women in political leadership saw an investment in drinking water, and facilities and infrastructure were actually almost twice as likely to be in good condition. And I think, Rwanda is such a great example. Rwanda is the global leader on women's political representation. They have 64% women in parliament. And actually Tanzania is also a great performer with 35% women parliamentarians. And interestingly, these two countries also have the highest economic growth rates in the region. Rwanda and Tanzania both achieved growth rates of above 7% in 2015. And education just across the board. Data collected from 19 countries from the OECD found an increase in women legislators directly resulted in an increase in total education expenditure. Additionally, countries experience less corruption, greater dialogue across ethnic lines, and more sustainable peace. And there's a World Bank study of 100 countries, and they showed a direct correlation between higher percentages of women in parliament and less corruption. And several studies shows that that women's increased political participation results in tangible gains for democratic governance, including greater responsiveness to citizens' needs, increased cooperation across party and ethnic lines, and women's leadership and conflict resolution styles have shown to embody democratic ideals that result in a less hierarchical and more participatory and collaborative manner than their colleagues. So I'd actually like to stop here and just share another personal story from one of the parliamentarians that actually we worked with at WAND, the Honorable Bushra Gohar. She was a parliamentarian in Pakistan, and she's currently the Senior Vice President of Pakistan's Awami National Party, which is a political party founded on nonviolent principles. But at one of our gatherings, she, Bushra shared a story about a 2009 incident in the Swat Valley region of Pakistan. There's one of the busiest community squares there is called Grain Chowk, but it was renamed by shopkeepers as Kuni Chowk, Bloody Square, because each day residents found 4 to 5 dead bodies, hanging from poles or trees, butchered by the Taliban. However, when the local provincial government organized a peace jirga to address the violence, the women political leaders were asked not to attend in order to not upset religious leaders and Taliban supporters. So in response, the women leaders convened their own peace jirga and demanded women's participation in the decision-making process. Additionally, the women sought an independent humanitarian commission to analyze the extent to which the current violence and devastation in Swat Valley was being caused by increased militarization of the region. Over 600 women from throughout the province participated in the jirga despite death threats and threats of violence, and the event was highly, highlighted widely in local newspapers and electronic media. Shortly thereafter, the Pakistan Women's Parliamentary Caucus, a multi-party and multi-ethnic caucus, introduced a resolution for the SWAT peace process in the National Assembly. It passed unanimously. And to this day, Pakistani women political leaders are leading rehabilitation efforts in areas affected by humanitarian crisis or extreme violence. So you really see how critically important it is that we have women, empowered women political leaders that are representing our grassroots and civil society. They have to work in tandem to really affect the change that we're hoping to create. So what is it that MinasList does? To address these barriers, the obstacles to women's increased political participation, we partner with in-country grassroots women's organizations and women parliamentarians to provide country-specific, culturally relevant educational resources, mentorship, and an online forum to build the capacity of aspiring women political leaders who would commit to advance women's rights as elected leaders. So if you look at the diagram here, MinasList will partner with an in-country organization, and we simultaneously recruit women legislators to really ensure women legislators that are effectively advancing women's rights. And we bring these together as a network for these aspiring women candidates. And then together we provide the educational training and really, encourage them to be able to run for political office on a women's rights platform. In 2015, MinasList launched its first initiative, the Afghan Pilot Project, to prepare 15 aspiring women leaders for Afghanistan's next parliamentary election. In Afghanistan, the obstacles to women's equal and substantive political representation are profound, as you can imagine. And while the 2004 Constitution included a reserved seat quota system for women, allocating 68 of the 249 seats, so that's 27% for women in national parliament. Culturally entrenched gender discrimination, significant social and economic inequities, and targeted political and gender-based violence limit Afghan women's ability to fully participate in the political sphere. So MinasList pilot program model has 4 components. A listening session where we first bring together the current women political leaders and the civil society representatives to really identify what are the unique barriers to women's equal participation, substantive participation, and then to come up with a strategy plan for overcoming those barriers. Then together we host what we call empowerment workshops, and they're really training capacity building opportunities for the aspiring women political leaders. And then we have a 2-year mentorship program where the current women political leaders commit to mentor an aspiring women leader for 2 years through her first year campaign and her first year in Parliament, because it's usually that first year in Parliament where, you know, all of a sudden it just, you know, corruption might kick in, or you just don't even know how to, you know, to really, you know, battle against maybe your party's agenda, you know, your husband's agenda, you know, whatever's, you know, kind of getting in your way. So the mentorship really provides its ongoing support. And then we have an online engagement program where, you know, all the women that are involved in Mina's List program, as well as, you know, our partners like WAND, like our other organizations, can really engage and provide ongoing resources and support and research material. So Mina's List collaborative approach helps the women political leaders and civil society activists develop a unified policy agenda on women's rights and together build a sustainable framework for women's substantive political participation. So just to give you a little taste of what came out in our listening session, because I mean, when we look at it, you know, I don't think any of us will be struck by you know, what was identified as the primary barriers for the women in Afghanistan, but you know, it's definitely daunting, right? So this is what, when Mina's List did our empowerment workshops, these were, you know, what we were trying to, you know, trying to provide the support systems, the training, the capacity to enable the aspiring women candidates to at least, you know, have some tools to be able to address these. So of the 40, you know, for the empowerment workshops, we had 40 Afghan women who applied to participate. The participants are actually chosen by our in-country partners. So they develop a committee of civil society activists, you know, NGO representatives, as well as current women parliamentarians, and they identify, you know, the women that they really think will effectively advance women's rights as elected leaders. And our 15 participants came from 10 different Afghan provinces, including many rural areas and regions steeped in conflict, such as Kunduz and Kandahar. In the empowerment workshops, in addition to our candidates, you know, our 10 women parliamentarian mentors represented both upper and lower house. We also, you know, had 5 women civil society activists and representatives from the Afghan government, including the senior advisor to Afghanistan's new election commission and a minister counselor for the permanent mission of Afghanistan to the UN, and Ashraf Ghani's director of policy delivery. And they all came to participate as trainers in this workshop. So for these 15 women, we had 22 trainers. It was extraordinary. At one point, one of the aspiring candidates said, you know, I can't believe I'm in this room with all these women I've been watching on TV for the past 10 years, and they're all here to train me. You know, it was really, really moving. So just some examples of what makes our curriculum different, right? There's so many, you know, political campaign training programs over there, you know, out there. What makes Mina's List unique? Well, because our goal is the equal and substantive participation, you know, we you know, those are really the topics that we address. So as you can see, these are the 6 parts to our training. And a couple just, you know, examples was Mrs. Silla Wardak, she's the Minister Counselor of the UN Mission of Afghanistan. She did a presentation on lessons learned for her unsuccessful campaign for Parliament in 2005. And using humor, she told a story about how, you know, she was, you know, so naive that she made a, you know, actually quite a dangerous mistake. And this is the picture of her poster. This was her roadside billboard campaign poster. And, you know, she included her personal email and her personal phone number. And she said, you know, that her phone rang off the hook, but not with calls from future voters, but from mothers who are looking for a bride for their sons, right? However, on a more serious note, you know, she discussed the importance of developing a campaign that's relevant and responsive to constituents' needs, and how she failed to recognize that her campaign that promoted her graduate level education and career with international NGOs meant little to her constituents who came from rural and uneducated communities and who suffered from poverty and insecurity. And she said, you know, she didn't win because her campaign didn't respond to her constituents' needs. Focusing on women's substantive participation, Ms. Shinkai Carolkal and Ms. Nargis Nehan, who is the Director of Policy Delivery for President Ashraf Ghani, they led a workshop on gender mainstreaming in the government. Ms. Carolkal discussed the importance of using a gender lens to assess national budgets and examine how the allocation of government resources impact men and women differently. And to recognize that budgets can either promote gender equality or exacerbate inequality. And Ms. Nargis Nahan, she actually walked participants through all the processes within the current government system of how policies get both introduced and implemented, and she taught them how at each kind of entry point where they could apply a gender lens to education policies, health policies, and livelihood policies. And then Ms. Hasina Safi and Ms. Maria Akrami, who are civil society activists, they did a whole presentation on international conventions that protect and promote women's rights, and actually taught the participants how they can use these conventions as tools to advance women's rights specifically in Afghanistan. So this is, how our curriculum is quite different. And these are just a couple of the participants. I loved what Zuleika Rafi talked about, because it's really, what I was hoping for the women in Afghanistan. She said, immediately after the post-Taliban era, most of us went into politics with our eyes closed, and we learned through falling and getting hurt. This opportunity for the next generation of female politicians to go with their eyes open and know what they're going to be about and how they can influence the women's agenda and make it a priority as a collective within the parliament. So this was, really wonderful. I guess that's the only way to describe it. It was pretty awesome. But just moving forward, I think we all recognize that the lack of political finance is one of the biggest barriers to women's political representation globally. So Minas List also has a 501c4 sister organization called Minas List International, where we help provide women candidates with alternative fundraising tools and technologies such as crowdsourcing, mobile banking, savings groups, to circumvent traditional male-dominated fundraising networks. So consider this. A female candidate from a conservative region may not be able to speak in a public forum to promote her political campaign. However, she can use social media tools like Facebook and Twitter to mobilize her constituency and communicate her message to voters without having to leave the privacy of her own home. Online crowdsourcing technology is a tool that can enable women candidates to raise political funds by leveraging their social networks rather than having to rely on traditional male-dominated associations and money networks. So through this technology, a woman candidate isn't reliant on long-standing professional affiliations. Her reach extends far beyond where she may or may not work, and she's not bound by limitations of geography. She can raise money from friends and family outside of her immediate constituency. And she can even raise campaign funds from individuals who live in other countries, so long as the campaign finance laws are not prohibitive. So she doesn't need to be deemed creditworthy in the traditional sense. There are no banks asking for collateral or proof of regular income. In essence, she can kickstart a political campaign from her living room. So last fall, Mina's List was chosen by MIT's Code for Good project, where a group of students worked on building a political campaign and fundraising app, a mobile app for your phone, for women candidates. And this app can help women use their social networks to raise political funds rather than having to, to rely on their traditional funding circles, political circles. And, when you think about this for, how this might be relevant is for a woman candidate, who's from a more traditional region like Kandahar or Balkh, she can promote her campaign and actually raise funds from women in Kabul through her fundraising phone app, because they want to be, support her platform as a women's rights candidate. So since that time, Mina's List, we've actually partnered with a couple other tech partners, Votes.com, Google's Women's Tech Makers Project, to further develop innovative strategies that can break down these barriers to women's political participation. So lastly, I just really want to highlight, why this is so important. Recent growth recent growth in women's political power is recognized as one of the most important trends in the past 100 years. So a 2013 report by the Interparliamentary Union found that this current increase in women members in parliament, the average, could lead to gender parity in 20 years if fully capitalized upon. So to fully leverage this upward trend, I really feel that we must direct our resources towards helping our communities break down the barriers that prevent women's full and substantive participation, and to provide the necessary tools and resources to empower women as political leaders and decision makers. We can't wait around for women to be included in male-dominated political circles so that half the world's population has a voice in national and international decision-making. Empowering women's political leadership is really going to have rippling effects on every level of society and the global condition today. So I'm just going to stop there because I really hope to have some conversation with you and some discussion, but please feel free to ask me any questions on anything that I've shared. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanya. That was really great. Very, very detailed. Lots of good information. Before we jump into the Q&A, I just want to remind everyone how to ask questions. You can type them into the question box. It should be on the right-hand side of your screen, and then I'll ask them aloud to Tanya. So a few people have asked this question. It seems that a number of our participants work on empowering women leaders here in the States. And they're curious about how to get involved in Minas List programs and how to support emerging leaders around the world from the U.S.
Thank you. Thank you for your interest. Thank you for your work in the U.S. We definitely need it here too. I think that certainly mentorship is really really needed and important. And while there's absolutely cultural differences, and those have to be recognized, at the same time, sometimes just actually speaking to another woman. I mean, everybody has to make a campaign plan, right? One of the things we did at the training with the women is we had an MP mentor sit down with an aspiring candidate and map out what her next steps were in her campaign plan, right? What businesses were around her that she might be able to get support, how to even just vote count from her own constituency. So those experiences that women and the women political leaders in the U.S. might have, or those of you who work with women political leaders, is really needed, particularly in emerging democracies or post-conflict environments where women are pretty new on the political scene. So I think that would be great, but please reach out to me afterwards and we can put our heads together because I would love to gain from your expertise.
Great, thank you. Christina Fiden asks, how important is women's participation in civic engagement as a means to helping women gain the skills required for political participation?
It's really, I think it's at least half. So it's why actually the first action, if I'm understanding your question correctly, mobilizing women at a civil society level to really advance women's political power and representation is critical. So what I mean is the first thing we do is we partner with an in-country women's rights civil society organization. And actually MinasList has been invited to other countries that don't have strong civil society, and it's not a good match because we can't do it without, if there's not that network of support for the women at the grassroots that can really mobilize around them, and then also hold them accountable once they get elected. And I think that we have to be, honest that this is the two part of the role, right? We need our women leaders that are going to continue to represent women at the grassroots in civil society. So having that mobilized grassroots is absolutely critical. And that's the other reason that I actually have the women in civil society identify who they think the next candidates should be. So all along there's that support system.
And on that note, Maya Perry asks, could you describe your recruitment strategy in a little bit more detail?
Sure. So for the Afghan pilot project, we partnered with two in-country organizations, so Afghan Women's Network, which is a network of 121 different women's organizations across Afghanistan. And then there's a couple of regions that AWN doesn't have strong reach, so we also partnered with Afghan Women's Educational Center that covers some of the regions that AWN isn't as widely involved in. And they created an open call for application, and they distributed that through their networks as well as Facebook, and then we also had UN Women in Afghanistan distribute it through, post it through UN Women networks, and then they collected the applications, and then simultaneously they formed a selection committee, and that committee had to have representation from civil society that weren't part of the project. So civil society women's leaders, I think they had one of the women Afghan judges was on it, and then representatives from each of the partner organizations, a representative from UN Women, and then a representative parliamentarian. And of course, we had to make sure that they were ethnically and regionally diverse to reflect our participants. And so they went through all 40 applications, came up with a short list of 10, and then did personal interviews. And I really actually I'm very, very proud of the way our partners did it. And for the most part, I turn it to them because long term, Mina's List isn't going to be there, right? It's, the women organizations these are going to be their leaders. So I really defer to them and their expertise. But we had one candidate, and I'm actually going to go back and show you her. Halima Askari, she's right there, right? So she's from Wardak province, which, depending on how intimately you know some of Afghan's politics, got a huge backlash last year for just corruption from the educational director. But it's also, it's kind of has some reputation around that. And so she wasn't selected. And it was actually the women that said that they were not, after the interview with her, that they were concerned that she still had her ties to some of the warlords and landowners were too strong for her to actually be an independent candidate. And the woman that really held true to that was actually on one of the selection committee members who was of the same ethnic group as Halimi. And so after she didn't get selected, Halimi called up the AWN office and said, I know that this is what I'm supposed to do, and I know that, Minas List is the organization, this training is what I'm supposed to be part of, and why didn't I get selected, and what do I need to do to come, to get there? So she actually drove 3 hours from Wardak up to the AWN office and met with them for another 3 hours, and the partners really, talked about all of their concerns regarding her other affiliations, and she committed that her commitment to a women's rights agenda would be her primary, her primary agenda as a political candidate. So I was really, really impressed both by her, but also the extent to which our partners were committed to upholding the agenda.
Great. Well, it's certainly a rigorous process. Next question. In your experience and opinion, do political quotas for women's representation help or harm the cause of substantive participation?
Mm-hmm. It's a very strong ongoing debate, but since you asked in my opinion, I think in many places the political quota system really is, I don't want to say the only means for women to get their foot in the door, but in a significant, creating a significant opening for enough women to get their foot in the door so that then you can start to even begin to have any kind of cultural shift, right? Cultural, gender cultural shift. So my personal opinion is that quotas are a very important tool. That said, yes, when you don't have, I'm just going to use again Afghanistan as an example. So in the 2005 Constitution or 2004 Constitution, they set aside 27% women parliament, seats in parliament for women. And yet at that time, 2001, 88% of Afghan women were illiterate still, right? After the Taliban. So your pool of applicants is actually quite limited. So in order to really ensure that the women are both willing and able right, to advance women's rights substantively, they need the education and the tools and the resources. And so, so that's our job. That's our job as civil society. So simple answer is I think that quotas are an important tool that's needed to open up the pathway, and then there's a lot more that still needs to be done in order to ensure substantive participation.
Thank you. What are some of the most surprising things about working to empower women in the international space?
Surprising?
Surprising.
Well,
I guess, you know, given your background and your history and your experience working in international spaces, you know, what has been surprising to you doing this work?
You know, I'm constantly learning, right? And maybe I'm not surprised because I don't go in expecting to know. You know, I'm sure that there's probably some surprise. Let me just think. I'll tell you some of the things that were challenging to deal with, right? So when I did, in 2011, I was part of a team and we did gender trainings for Lebanon's 28 different political parties. And we did them for both male representatives of the party as well as female representatives. And Lebanon has 3% women in parliament and 0 in the executive, right? And yet you're talking, it's, you know, historically known as a leader for women in education, you know, economic development. You know, women are really empowered in many other aspects of society. So this gap, this gender gap in politics just doesn't make sense. And when I kept asking the women, you know, when we were brainstorming what were the barriers and obstacles, the one thing I kept hearing was, well, we want to be involved in politics, but the men just won't let us. And, you know, and right there, right, that in and of itself is the primary issue, because if you are waiting to be allowed, right, and there's this great Groucho Marx quote, and he said, you know, I'm happy to give up my seat if I wasn't already sitting in it, right? Like, who's going to give up their power if they don't have to? And not that, you know, not that we can't have male allies, and I think actually in many ways our male allies are the ones that really help women in the beginning get engaged and get the resources they need. If we're waiting around for the men to let us be involved, it's just not going to happen for a while, I think. So I'm sorry it wasn't so surprising, but that's been like one of the things that's been hardest, you know, to kind of grapple with.
Yes, definitely. It's a challenging paradox. Next question. Do you think Mina's List model for achieving equal representation between men and women in national government could be self-sustaining if achieved?
I actually really do, and that was my primary goal with it, because you know, it's not going to do anything if it can't sustain itself. So our primary focus is building the capacity and the networks at, you know, in country for the women candidates, right? And those networks ideally are long term. So that's why in the listening session we brought together, you know, so it's a 3-day listening session, and we brought the women out of country. So we had 10 current women parliamentarians representing, you know, each of the major ethnic groups, and then we had 7 women civil society activists. Oh, this is something surprising, actually. So, you know, this group, both the civil society and the women MPs, you know, have been really at the helm of women's rights movement in Afghanistan pretty much, you know, since 2002, since 2003. But they actually, they no longer felt unified. The women, civil society, I mean, that's a very broad statement. I don't say they no longer felt unified, but the women civil society activists really felt like the women MPs no longer communicated with them, were no longer really telling them what was going on, that they no longer felt that this was their representative, you know, that they had the ear of their women MP who they worked so hard to support and get elected, right? And so, so there was a lot of resentment towards the women MP. At the same time, the women MPs felt a lot of anger towards the civil society activists because they felt like when they were running for their campaigns, when they were really up against some, huge battles, that civil society didn't always support them, and so, and often kind of would, fall into just critiquing, right? Always pointing out when they didn't do something right, as opposed to really, providing the support they needed. So the goal of bringing these two groups together first, and even just having them begin talking and really identify a unified agenda, that's a first step towards building this network for these women, and then the long-term mentorship. So I really do believe that it is sustainable, and we keep it small, right? We're not trying to train 100 women. We're doing 15, and we're doing it substantively. So yeah.
Great, thank you. It looks like we have just one more question. Can you talk more about the cultural challenges of doing this kind of work in places like Afghanistan and Pakistan that don't necessarily have the best track record for women's rights?
Mm-hmm. Cultural challenges, yeah, they're huge, right? But they're huge regardless of whether MinasList is there or not, right? And that was actually what allowed me to have the courage to do the first project in Afghanistan. So when I was first starting out MinasList, because I had really brainstormed the idea with Shinkai and some of the other women MPs, I wanted just to go and talk to civil society in Afghanistan and ask them, did they think that this was viable? Did they think this was a sustainable model? And what would we need to do differently? And so I went to Afghanistan, and I remember it was the first day I was going to meet with Hasina Safi. She's the ED of Afghan Women's Network, and I was so excited, right? I had seen, Abigail Disney's Peace Unveiled, and I'd been like admiring Hasina for years and couldn't wait to meet her and thought this was like an extraordinary meeting. And I walk in the office, and there's like 25, 30 women in the room. And she had called together the entire board of AWN. She had called members up from some of the provincial offices and projects. And it turned into a 4.5-hour meeting. And to be honest, I spent a lot of that 4.5 hours, I don't want to say trying to talk them out of doing Mina's List, but kind of, I was like, okay, on top of it, on top of the fact that, your women candidates already have so much against them, and, they're being targeted, by the Taliban, they're being, pushed back against, by different political factions, and now you're going to have a U.S. organization come in and support them. And so I was like, you're putting yourself in danger, you shouldn't do this. And really, making sure that we flushed out all of the cultural barriers as well as cultural harms. I of course, did not want to do anything that was going to put my partners in even greater harm than they already were. And at the end of that 4.5-hour meeting, Hasina is walking me out, and she takes me aside, and she said, Tanya, I want you to know, we heard everything you said. And we heard, all your concerns and, how you're so worried, about the harm, as well as even just kind of, legality around sovereignty issues. She goes, we heard it all. She said, but, every day I leave my house in the morning and I say goodbye to my kids, and I don't know if I'm going to see them that night when I come home. And she said, so this is a fear that we have, and this is harm that we face every single day of our lives here as women. So if we don't do something now, my daughter has no chance. She's not going to have any future. I won't accept this kind of future for her. She said, so we really, really need, she says, we need you to come. We need you to come to Mina's List, because we need empowered women leaders that will ensure that my daughter, has a much brighter future than I do, and safer future. So then I went home and cried, and I committed myself to do Mina's List. So thank you so much. That's, thank you so much for this opportunity with all of you today.
Yes, thank you so much, Tanya. This has been really informative and detailed and moving. So we appreciate your time, and want to thank everyone who joined us on their computers at home. We'll be sending out follow-up materials, including the link to the recording for this webinar, and we ask that you complete our brief feedback survey, which will appear when the webinar ends. So again, thank you so much, Tanya. Thank you to everyone for joining us, and with that, we'll end the webinar.